Hello, macroeconomic students. So this is, well, I'm not sure yet, one or two videos. We'll see how long it takes, going over chapter three, supply and demand. So it's only been a few years now, as I record this in January 2025, that I have talked about chapter three, supply and demand in this macro course because um, microeconomics used to be a prerequisite at Dutchess for macroeconomics for a number of reasons. We changed that, and I think some good, some bad consequences to that. But one of the consequences is I got to spend some time on supply and demand, whereas before I could assume that you knew some. Um, a lot of chapter three is, or pretty much all of chapter three is written for microeconomics, looking at individual markets. But I will try to hint at, and in our going over this material, try to emphasize some of the things that are going to be important for this economic tool in our course, in the macroeconomic course. So, with that intro to this, let's go. So, why can we look at supply and demand, right? Why is that? Well, markets are basically bringing sellers and buyers together, and that usually happens by companies deciding that they want to produce something that they think people are going to be willing to pay for at a level that is at or above what it's going to cost them to make it. And consumers are going to decide based on their abilities and means and what they want to buy. And if the price is too high, markets are going to adjust. And in many cases, we can analyze a lot of that activity between buyers and sellers with a model, simple model of supply and demand, which you've likely all seen in high school. Um, but let's very specifically kind of talk about what we mean by demand, what we mean by supply. When I teach this in microeconomics, I even much more strongly emphasize that these are two different constructs. But I will try to emphasize that to some degree here as well, right? So which of these represents demand, right? So the quantity that consumers, well, first thing is, as you see, both A and B are options focus on consumers. Because demand has nothing to do with whether the products are available that people might want to buy. It is at each price, how much are people, the consumers, or potential consumers, willing to buy, right? So let's read these A and B. So it's not C, right? So it's either quantity the consumers are willing to buy at a particular price, which is how we normally think of, we might normally think of demand is, right now the price of gas is somewhere about $3 a gallon as I record this in January 2025. Um, how much gas are people buying at $3? And that's part of demand, but the construct of demand you need to understand also reflects potential changes in that price and how consumers will respond to those changes. So if the price of gas goes from $3 to $4, well, that's not going to be a change in demand because that is part of what we're defining as demand. So the answer is, in fact, B, the quantity that consumers are willing and able to buy at all possible prices. So it's not just the $3 a gallon that exists at the moment. It's also what if it goes down to 250? What if it goes up to $4? How will that change how much consumers are willing and able to buy? And how will that change their incentives and behaviors? All the stuff we talked about in the intro chapter, chapter one. So you can think of it as the actual price or the current price and kind of quote unquote what if prices. Now I say or price levels, right? So everything I've said up until this price levels thing has focused on, well, the market, in this case, the market for gasoline. In this course, when we analyze markets, we're often going to be thinking about, and especially when we get to chapter 12, the market for everything. And we're going to call that aggregate demand. So not just the market for for gasoline, but also the market for cars added to that, and then how much economic activity people want to buy for cars and houses and computers and cell phone service plans, and you put it all together, and you can't talk about the the price, right? Um, but you can talk about the price level and what's happening to that. That's where inflation and deflation come into play. But this chapter focuses on individual markets to create this model of supply and demand that we will then use to analyze the economy as a whole, aggregate demand. Supply and demanded, so how much goods and services, well, back to individual markets for a second, how much gasoline people want to buy at $3 a gallon. Right? So the amount that consumers are willing and able to buy at a particular price, right? Or at a particular price level for the economy as a whole. So here is an individual market. So instead of gasoline, the authors are using the market for Uber rides, right? So we can think of this as a market for Uber rides, let's say in downtown Manhattan, because that's going to come up in a little bit here. Okay, so we can represent demand in a few different ways. In microeconomics, sometimes we'll be focusing on it as we would focus on it as a demand schedule where we list, hey, at each price, per day or per hour or whatever, how many Uber rides would people want to buy at if the price per ride was each of these different things. And as is logical, hopefully, as the price goes down, people's incentive, right? People respond to incentives. Lower price means, hey, the value of that Uber ride, or the cost that they have to give up to get that Uber ride goes down. So when they're doing their cost benefit analysis, say lower price, all right, I'll take an Uber ride instead of taking the subway because it's a little more comfortable. So when we plot these demand schedules, and this is the version that we'll see far more often for demand in this course, is just a curve without any numbers often, just recognizing that, hey, it's a universal, we call it the law of demand, that pretty much in all scenarios, and almost every scenario you can think of, as price rises, the quantity that consumers are willing and able to buy decreases. So higher price means the quantity. So I guess I should take a step back. We're going to plot these curves by convention with the price of the item or the price level, if we're thinking about the economy as a whole, on the vertical axis, the quantity on the horizontal axis. And because of that, it creates a downward sloping demand curve. This law of demand at higher prices, higher on the graph means we're further to the left on the graph. People want to buy a lower quantity, are able to buy, can afford to buy a lower quantity. As price goes down, the quantity demanded, how much they would want to be able to buy increases. So downward sloping demand curve. So often I will just go up to the board and draw a downward sloping thing. In this class, again, I've mentioned how we're going to use it in chapter 12 for the economy as a whole, and we're going to call this demand aggregate demand. But we're also going to use it in some other chapters, like when we're looking at the supply and demand of money and supply and demand for foreign currency in later chapters, for example. So each point is a specific quantity demanded, and the whole thing is demand, right? So the demand curve, okay, so whole. Does demand change when the price consumers have to pay changes, but nothing else that the consumer cares about changes? So to answer this question, you need to really think about how we just defined what demand is. Demand is how much consumers are willing and able to buy at all different possible prices. So when the price goes up, right, for Uber rides, for example, when the price goes from $13.75, where people wanted to buy 900, it goes up to $14, and people only want to buy 850 Uber rides per day. That's not a change in demand because of how we've defined demand. It includes that possibility that the price changes. It's purposefully been defined that way so that only things other than the price that the consumer cares about that changes will change demand. So something other than the price has to change, right? And when those other things change, then demand shifts. Or we see that on the graph as a change shift in demand. So analytically, if you to kind of ask if you're given an event and ask, does is this going to cause a change in demand? You can you're more likely to answer that correctly by modifying the question to say, even if the price stayed the same that consumer has to pay, will people want to be able to buy more or less? If the quantity demanded, the amount that people are willing and able to buy at each price, even if the so price of Uber rides, even if the price stayed at 13.75, if something's going to change in the market where it's going to cause people to either want more Uber rides, or the example we're about to go over, or want less than 900 Uber rides, well, that would be a change in demand, something other than price causing them to want to change their behavior. And that we will have to show as a shift in demand. So an increase in demand is where at each price, right? So at this 13.75, let's say that's where we are here. If people want to buy instead of 900 Uber rides, having this demand one, if something changes, now they want to buy 1,500 Uber rides, well, that's an increase in demand. Or if they wanted 900 Uber rides at $13.75, and something changes, now they want 600 Uber rides, that's a decrease in demand, a shift to the left. So for our purposes, right, the important thing to recognize is increase in demand. Every price, people want to buy more, shift to the right, shift to the left, decrease in demand. So here's the example that the book goes over on this. And they use one from, well, 2019, 2021, suggesting that in 2021, at any given price, regardless of what price it is, whether it's 13.75 or $13.25, the quantity of Uber rides people wanted to buy in 2021 was higher than in 2019. Now, why might this be really a good example to demonstrate this? Why might that have been true? Well, as was very true during that period after 2020 to 2021, all kinds of shit changed. It was the pandemic, right? Absolutely, people wanted to buy less Uber rides at each price in 2021 because nobody wanted to get into a freaking vehicle with anybody in 2021, or at least a lot of people didn't because of COVID, right? So this is a logical example to demonstrate a decrease in demand because there was a decrease in demand of all kinds of things, including the aggregate economy, which is why we had a very deep but short recession when the economy effectively shut down. But we'll talk more about that. Okay. Um, so here's a question. So which of the following would increase demand for electric vehicles? I say now to try to say more the short term, not over like decades or something like that. Right? So people become, so in the next month or year or something, people become more concerned about climate change. The price of electricity decreases due to more installed capacity, i.e., more production of electricity. So the price of that goes down. Price of gas goes up because OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, decreases production, so it causes global gas prices to increase. Will none of these increase demand, or will all of these increase demand for electric vehicles? Think about each one. Think about each one in the context of, will it cause this D1 to D2 shift, right? Even if electric vehicles stayed, let's call it $40,000 a vehicle, will the result of each of those events, will it, or any of them, will it increase how many electric vehicles people want to buy? And the answer is, for this example, is all of them. So if people become more concerned about climate change, they're more likely to be willing to spend that 40,000 for the electric vehicle. So some more people would buy it. If the price of electricity goes down, so if you have an electric vehicle, you need to power it with electricity. So if the cost of powering that vehicle goes down, your ownership cost goes down. So there's more incentive to buy that electric vehicle. So that would also increase demand, shift the demand curve for electric vehicles to the right. Price of gasoline, if that goes up, well, then one of the major alternatives to the electric vehicle that consumers might be thinking of buying is a gas-powered one. And if the gas-powered one becomes much more expensive, then people are much more likely to buy the electric one. So all of these would increase demand, shifted to the right. So that one, this goes over a few of and again, this is microeconomic, but also can translate when we get to the aggregate economy in many ways, for some of these things, right? So what are the types of things that in general change demand, right? So consumer taste preferences change. I'm not going to go over this goofy video from a goofy movie, but climate change could be factored into that. So people, care more about that. That factors into their choices. So for all kinds of reasons, consumers' preferences might change, right? Fashion changes, all kinds of other stuff, seasonal environmental consciousness, etc. Now, from a very macroeconomic standpoint, something that would change demand or increase demand for everything. Now, well, I should say everything, but for the total amount of spending that people would do when you add up all of their demand at each price level. Well, if consumers are very confident about the economy, they're more likely to spend. So that's one of the macroeconomic factors that would increase aggregate demand, right? So, and that's one of the reasons why one of the things that you'll often see I believe it's a monthly basis, but polls from on consumer confidence, and why the Wall Street Journal publishes those things, because that generally is very predictive of an economy that's likely to do well. And when those types of results come out, where those people are becoming more confident, stock market usually responds because they anticipate an increase in demand, increase of an economic activity. Prices of related goods. Okay, so microeconomic examples, right? So if the price of beef increases, what's logically would happen to demand for chicken? Well, the assumption here is that for many people, my wife and I included, beef and chicken on any given day or week are substitutes for each other. So if the price of beef goes up, we are at least a bit more likely to buy some chicken. So for substitutes, if the price of one increases, the demand for the other thing that you might buy instead increases. Complements, which is the opposite of substitutes, things you buy together. So price of beef increases, the demand for hot dog buns would likely decrease, because who the hell wants a hot dog? I'm sorry, hamburger buns. Hamburger buns. So who the hell would want a hamburger bun if you're not going to put something like a hamburger in it, because it's barely food. It's just a carrier for the beef. So when you buy two things together, if the price of one goes up, so part of your expenditure increases, the demand for the other likely decreases. That was basically the scenario when I go back here to in the opposite direction with the price of electricity. So electricity is a complement to your electric vehicle. So if the price of electricity goes down, the demand for the other thing is likely to increase. And for the substitute, right? So the price of gas, well, if that goes up, the demand for the alternative, the electricity, would increase, which would increase demand for the electric vehicles. So complements and substitutes. Now, I highlight in microeconomics often that most things in microeconomics are very intuitive. And these should, if you think about them, be like, well, yeah, of course that makes sense, right? There's not rocket science behind it, but logically being able to think through this is a huge part of understanding, well, how markets work and microeconomics in general. Right? Macro sometimes it's logical, sometimes a little less so because there's so many it's a complicated ecosystem, right? Hard to really understand when one thing happens, how's that going to cause the economy as a whole to change. Um, Incomes. So we can apply this one pretty directly both to microeconomic examples as well as macro. So from a microeconomic individual goods standpoints, for most goods, the demand, if people's incomes increase, is that demand would increase because they have more money to buy stuff. However, if people's incomes increase, there are some things where people would actually buy less stuff, right? And we would talk about that a lot more in microeconomics course. Like so people normal goods, since most goods would people's demand would increase when income increases, when income and demand move together. Well, that's what would happen with most things. But there are some goods where if people's incomes go up, the demand goes down. And the classic example in most textbooks that college students can often relate to are things like ramen noodles, fast food, right? Things that are called inferior goods, things that people would rather have something else if they could afford it. But if their incomes go up, they buy less of those inferior goods, spam, for example. Now, from an economy as a whole standpoint, when you put all goods together, both the normal goods and inferior goods, since most goods are normal goods, stands to reason that for the economy as a whole, when people's incomes go up, total economic activity, aggregate demand or desire to buy, aggregate demand would increase. And we'll talk about that much more in chapter 12. So what do we got next here? All right, so again, very logical. If there's a potential increase or decrease in potential buyers, that's going to either increase or decrease demand. So growing or shrinking populations. The world in general has had growing populations, so demand for most things has grown over time. However, we're getting to a place from a demographic standpoint on the planet where most or many developed countries, right, countries that are further along on their economic um, um, development, so more advanced, are starting to shrink, right? Led by countries like Japan, China for that, and for they're not even so far along actually, but they're shrinking for other reasons. U.S. still has been growing a bit, mostly because of immigration, but as I record this in January 2025, we'll see if that's true in the near term with some of the policies of deportations and stuff proposed by the incoming administration. Um, but many developed countries are shrinking, right? So demand for all kinds of stuff is going to go down. Okay, demand changes based on people's expectations as well. So if people expect prices of something to go down in the future, will that increase or decrease demand now? So for example, electric vehicles. Um, so this is an interesting time to be recording this because all kinds of new policies shifts are going to be happening in the near future. As I record this in January, actually like 2 days before Trump's inauguration. So one of the things he has suggested to do, which is kind of amazing given that his buddy Elon Musk will not benefit from it, is to get rid of the subsidies for electric vehicles. So if the subsidy, i.e. the federal government basically helping people pay for electric vehicles, if that does in fact go away, if that's people expect that to go away, Um, well, that's going to increase demand now because people are going to buy it before the price goes up. So if people expect the price of electric vehicles to go up in the future, they're going to increase their demand now. Now, the example that there or the question I actually have on the slide here is says if people expect price to go down in the future, the opposite of the example I just went over with the subsidies for the electric vehicles going away. So if people thought there was going to be more subsidies, or if people think the price of gas is going to go down, then or oil, that maybe they'll wait if they can to fill up their oil tanks. Right. So if people think the price of something is going down in the future, if they can, they'll likely wait to buy it in the future. Now, from a macroeconomic standpoint, this is why if I asked, and I often do, ask students, which would you rather have? Prices on average go up by 3% or 2% next year, um, or go down, which so inflation being the first one, or go down by 2%. Deflation on average prices going down. Obviously, individuals are going to say, well, I want things to get less expensive, so I like things going down. The Federal Reserve, however, although they don't like a lot of inflation, they really don't like any deflation because it sets up this dynamic, right? It can set up if it becomes kind of a long-term expectation. If people continuously expect prices of things to go down, so they expect deflation, the Fed would get worried because that often slows down economic activity because then people don't buy stuff. Um, then companies can't sell stuff, and so they don't hire workers, and then that's going to cause prices to go down some more, and it becomes this almost self-fulfilling prophecy and spiral that created what if for in Japan in the 90s often called a lost decade where they had deflationary pressure happening continuously. China has much more recently been grappling with the same dynamic, right? So chronic deflation, as nice as that sounds to an individual, is as or more worrying to the Federal Reserve as chronic inflation because it slows economic activity and can often become kind of a feedback loop that continues to kind of build on itself because of this dynamic because people respond to those incentives. Okay, which of the following would cause an increase in demand for large gas-powered sports utility vehicles? Price of steel increasing due to trade tariffs. Okay, so this is kind of a topical question. Price of steel decreasing due to end of trade tariffs. Both would increase demand, neither would increase demand. Or yeah, increase demand. So when I asked this poll in class, many students would say price of steel decreasing. And the logic usually behind that sounds logical, right? So, well, if the price of steel, imagine you need some steel to make some cars, right, for the frame and stuff. So typically the car would likely be less expensive to produce. So the assumption there, people thinking as consumers would say, well, if the price of the car goes down, then I'm more likely to buy a car. So that would increase my demand. But remember what demand was. Demand already reflects the possibilities that the price might change. Although this is Uber rides, put these into thousands and you can think of it as cars. And if the price goes down, right, that's not a change at any given time period. That's not a change in demand. It's just moving up and down demand. So a change in the price of steel. Another way to think about why this is not a change in demand is would the consumer directly give a shit about the price of steel when they're thinking of buying a car? No, no. The consumer only thinks, well, if the price of steel goes down, then the car is going to get less expensive. That's not a foregone conclusion. It depends on how the seller responds and how what the market is like. So the price of steel is not in the car market is not something that the consumer cares directly about. It's something that the producer cares directly about. And that's what I emphasize much more in microeconomics of, is this something that's directly gonna that the consumer is gonna care about? If so, then demand might be changing. But this is something for the car market or for the SUV market that the producer would care about. So it would be a change in supply. And I usually, talk about producers, sellers pretty much interchangeably. Okay. So just like demand was the quantity that possible buyers in the market would want to be able to buy at different prices, supply is sellers, producers in the market. How much would they want to be able to sell at different prices? And just like demand, not just the actual price that might exist at any moment in time in the market, but also what if the price is higher? What if the selling price is lower? And I'm not going to go over that too much. Right? So thinking about so take off your consumer hat and put on your producer hat, your seller hat. If you're a producer and seller and the price of the product that you're producing and selling increases, the quantity that you would be interested in selling of that product would what? Well, it would increase, right? Why would that be case? Well, if Uber rides were becoming, if the current price of Uber rides was 12.50, but then something happened where the price went up to like $14 and you're a potential, you might say, well, I'm not going to become an Uber driver, um, or I'm going to drive less, right? I'm going to be willing to produce less or work less hours at 12.50. But if I can get 14 bucks per ride, I'm be willing to put in some more hours, right? So the quantity that producers are willing to produce as the price goes up, because the price is their revenue, right? Higher price is what the consumer has to give up. Higher price is what the producer gets. So higher price is a good thing, all other things equal for the seller. So just like the law of demand was, the opposite, since price was a bad, i.e. what the consumer has to give up, downward sloping thing, right? So the law of demand was higher price, right? As price rises, quantity demanded falls. So that's why this is a downward sloping thing on demand. High price means quantity. We're further to the left. Well, the law of supply is the opposite. High price is a good thing for the seller, right? So law of supply, as the price rises, the quantity that they're willing and able to produce, that they can produce profitably, for example, increases. So upward sloping thing. And often when we're using supply and demand analysis, whether it be an individual market, like the foreign exchange market or the market for borrowing and lending money, or the aggregate demand, when we talk about the economy as a whole, I'll often just draw an upward sloping supply curve, a downward sloping demand curve, and then in the next part of this chapter, when we bring the supply and demand together, start analyzing, well, where's the price likely to fall? So sticking with the supply, with the seller, so we have two different changes here. I should say two changes here. So which is the result of a potential Uber riders, so potential the demanders fearing COVID, right? So imagine we're at supply one. This is the 2019 before COVID. Um, is the decrease in people wanting to buy that we saw as a decrease in demand, is that going to be reflected by moving from, let's say we were the old price was 1350 on the supply one, but now people are wanting to buy less rides, so the price is going to go down and we're going to be at this point B. So movement along the supply curve. So answer A. Or is it going to cause a shift in supply? Answer B. Well, we're analyzing how the demand change is impacting the seller market, and that's going to be a moving down the supply curve, answer A, right? The shift in supply is saying, you know what, even if the price of Uber rides, something would have to happen for less Uber rider drivers to be willing to supply Uber rides at 1350 for us to move from supply one to supply two. So to shift the curve, right, from point A to point C, something other than the demand or the price that they're getting has to change. And this undoubtedly happened as well during COVID, is this shift. But this shift from S1 to S2 isn't the result of the decrease in demand for Uber rides, which would move us down from point A to point B. It's from the drivers themselves not wanting to do the driving as much because of fear of getting COVID and getting a bunch of strangers in your cars, right? It's probably like there. Um, so that would be a change in supply, something other than the selling price causing potential sellers, in this case drivers, from wanting to do it, even if the price that they were able to get didn't change. So this is a pretty topical one as I record this in January 2025 because this just went into effect, not at $15, that was the original proposal, but the just recently the Manhattan started implemented congestion pricing, where if during peak times you drive a vehicle into downtown Manhattan, um, and it's different for different types of vehicles, but you have to pay a toll. Um, well, for Uber drivers, if they have to pay a toll, it basically adds an extra cost of production to them. So at any given price that they could sell their Uber rides at, it's less profitable. So it's going to cause, so this increase in cost of production is going to cause a decrease in supply, right? So supplying the rides, having to pay a toll increases, just like an increase in gas prices would cause it to be more expensive to power their vehicles. Well, an increase in toll causes it be more expensive to drive their vehicles. Similarly, so it would be an increase in cost of production. So at any given price that they're selling their rides at, less incentive to produce because there's less profit to be made. So when cost of production increase, supply decreases, shifts to the left, right? This like this S1 to S2. Or if cost of production decrease, right, like gas prices go down, for example, the supply at any given selling price would increase. So it shift the other way. Okay, what happens to the supply of solar panels as the technology to produce them improves? Well, that's a specific example of this production cost decreasing. Typically, anytime technology is improving to produce something, supply is increasing. And for many products, solar panels being a great example, the supply has been marching to the right, has been increasing for decades as the technology to produce them and the efficiency at which they operate has continued to increase, which means at any given price for selling those solar panels, there's more profit to be made because it's less costly to produce. So shift to the right. So any kind of increase in technology, pretty much always shifting to the right. Less costly to produce the panels, more profitable at each selling price. And anytime you hear the term price, that is for the producer how much they're getting. for selling the product. And just like we went over the example of changes in demand, if there's a change in the population of potential buyers, if the number of sellers is going up, that's going to increase supply, shift it to the right. If the number of sellers is going down, that's going to shift it to the left, decrease supply. And this is the sad story of when Russia invaded Ukraine, and Ukraine provides a lot of, or provided a good chunk, a significant percentage of the world's wheat, for example. Prices of wheat soared because the supply in the market, fewer sellers, supply decreased. Okay, I'm going to stop there in this video. It's already 40 minutes. I'm going to make a second video for bringing supply and demand together.